Coming to you from the shores of sparkling Lake Michigan, the National Writers Series welcomes you to Traverse City, where we're celebrating 15 years as a year-round book festival. We are the premier home for passionate readers who love inspiring conversations with best-selling and award-winning authors. Tonight, 4 incredible organizations have partnered together to bring our featured author to Traverse City. First, the Grand Traverse Band of Ottawa and Chippewa Indians. Their mission as a sovereign nation is to honor our ancestors and the rights preserved for the tribal nation. They shall promote and protect the well-being of their present and future members through culture, sovereignty, treaty rights, natural resources, health, public safety, education, financial management, housing, and agriculture, and shall be responsive to the needs and statements of tribal members. The second organization we're partnering with is the Mindemoya Healing Circle. The Mindemoya Healing Circle began in 2016 when a group of respected matriarchs, grandmothers, and wise women came together to discuss how to support tribal people in recovery and struggling to achieve it. They are focused on supporting healing and wellness through the concept of Mindemoya, which embodies elder women's wisdom, leadership, love, and compassion. The third partner is the Grand Traverse Regional Land Conservancy. Their mission is to protect significant natural, scenic, and farmlands, and advancing stewardship now and for future generations. By continuing to protect the region's finest natural, scenic, and farmlands, the Conservancy will have reinforced the foundation of a priceless legacy that all of us will pass on to future generations. The National Writers Series is dedicated to holding great conversations with today's best authors and building the writing and reading skills of youth. Many thanks to Clark and Karen Bunting, who stepped up as our named sponsor of this event. These 4 partners and our sponsors came together because of their shared belief that humanity must respect and care for Mother Earth as we would a loved one, not as a resource to be exploited. With the collective power of these partners, we are thrilled to welcome #1 New York Times bestselling author Robin Wall Kimmerer. Kimmerer is a mother, scientist, decorated professor, and enrolled member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation. She is best known for writing The Serviceberry, Abundance and Reciprocity in the Natural World, Braiding Sweetgrass, Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teachings of Plants and Gathering Moss, a natural and cultural history of mosses. She lives in Syracuse, New York, where she is a SUNY Distinguished Teaching Professor of Environmental Biology and the founder and director of the Center for Native Peoples and the Environment. Kimmerer will be joined on stage by Matthew L.M. Fletcher. He is the Harry Burns Hutchins Collegiate Professor of Law and Professor of American Culture at the University of Michigan. He also serves as co-director of the law school's program on race, law, and history. He sits as the Chief Justice of the Grand Traverse Band of Ottawa and Chippewa Indians, the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi Indians, and the Porch Band of Creek Indians. The National Writers Series salutes our amazing audiences, dedicated volunteers, and generous supporters for helping us raise the next generation of readers and writers through our free education programs across the region. This season of amazing authors is made possible through major support by the Green Brick Foundation, Northgard Technology Group, Golden Fowler Home Furnishings, Prout Financial, and Ward and Mary Bevins Gillette. Tonight's event sponsor is the Harrington Fitch Family Foundation. Our natural food sponsor is Oriana. Our literary sponsors include Bay Books and the Grand Traverse Regional Community Foundation. Tonight's live streaming is exclusively underwritten by Nancy Davey. Thanks to our major media sponsor, the Traverse City Record Eagle, and our media partner, Interlochen Public Radio. For information on future events, programs, and how to support our nonprofit work, please visit nationalwriterseries.org. Now, please welcome to the stage Tribal Council Secretary Anna Miller.
Hi, everyone. On behalf of the Grand Traverse Band of Ottawa and Chippewa Indians, I'm honored to welcome you to tonight's gathering. We are deeply grateful to support this event with Dr. Robin Wall Kimmerer, whose work in braiding sweetgrass and the serviceberry teaches that the earth offers gifts freely and that our role is to live in gratitude, which she describes as recognition, responsibility, and reciprocity. Her vision of a gift economy carries forward teachings that many Indigenous communities have long lived by. That care, not extraction, sustains us, and that abundance grows through relationship and respect. At Grand Traverse Band, we strive to live out those values in our governance and service. Whether it's restoring fish passage to the bay, improving access to housing and health care, or standing for justice and sovereignty, we work to give back to our land and to our people. Our Chief Appellate Justice, Matthew Fletcher, who joins Dr. Kimmerer tonight, demonstrates that law, too, can be a gift when used to protect what is sacred and strengthen community. Dr. Kimmerer ends the Serviceberry with an invitation to offer our own gifts through time, creativity, action, and care. Tonight's exchange of knowledge is part of that. We would also like to welcome Martha Teichner from CBS Sunday Morning, who is here with us tonight. And we look forward to this special conversation, and thank you for joining us tonight. Now, please welcome Robin and Matthew to the stage.
Well, bonjour. It's nice to see all of you here, to the extent that we can see you. It's kind of dark. I'm really pleased tonight to be here with Dr. Kimmerer, Robin Wall Kimmerer, one of our truly great authors, one of our truly great leaders, philosophers, scientists. It's hard to meet a person who has so many different skill sets, so many different ways of looking at the universe. And it's wonderful as an Anishinaabe person to be able to say that this person has touched me directly, and I love her work. So this is the second time we've done this. I don't know if you knew this, but we did this during COVID when it was sort of a weird thing. I have no memory of that whatsoever. Yeah. We both agree we didn't even know. So I mean, I remember that I did it. I just don't remember what happened. So I'm going to start off by asking, I guess, an opening question for you, Robin. The question sort of is, tell us about Serviceberry. What is the Serviceberry? What motivated you to write this book, and what's it about?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, put the microphone.
Oh, yeah, technology. Well, let me start with who is Serviceberry, because this wonderful tree, like all plants, are good teachers, and so it was the name Serviceberry that really led me to think about it as an analog for economics of the delivery of goods and services. But this beautiful plant, I know you have it here, right? Plenty of them. And in Bodwe Wadmin, we call it bozakman as well, like one of the best of the berries. And this wonderful tree has been, it's medicine, it's food, but in the case of the book, it's a teacher to me. And this book really was born out of an essay that I wrote for Emergence magazine. And I'll tell you, they phoned me up and they said, could you write something about economics? And I said, of course not. Of course not. I'm a botanist and I know nothing about economics. And their wise or crazy answer was, well, that's why we asked you. Yeah, and in that exploration, I did turn them down, and I said, I really don't know anything about economics. But then I remembered that I know, as a botanist, a lot about the economy of nature and how nature delivers goods and services. And in my lack of understanding of Western economics, I was just thinking, why? Why do we structure things the way that we do, which are so counter to the way nature provides for all living beings? And so it's really an inquiry into why do we do these things instead of aligning ourselves with natural law?
Well, did you bring up natural law because I'm a lawyer, or? I was going to bring it up myself.
Was
but
that the trigger word?
Yeah, this is great. So I want to talk about two things, and I don't know how to start, which one to start with, but you know, I'm a legal academic, and you know, I'm also somebody who's indigenous, and I write in a field of law that is really the heart of everything I am as an indigenous person. It's Indian law. But in the field, in the legal academy and the academy generally, indigenous people, indigenous rights, indigenous issues are very, very secondary, tertiary. They're a niche area. And so it's not surprising that, but pleasant to hear that an economics journal is interested in hearing for your perspective as a scientist, as an Anishinaabe person, to write about economics. You know, I actually wrote a law review article, sort of as a lark, many years ago, called "The Law and Economic," or the Law and Economics. We have this thing in the academy called Law and Economics, and it's horrible. Basically, it is the law should be efficient. It doesn't matter if who wins or loses. The outcomes are irrelevant, so long as the money flows as efficiently as possible, which is as nihilistic as you can possibly get. Sounds like American government, but that is. I sort of made a joke called the cannibalism of law and economics, where we're eating ourselves. And it was more of a paper about a William Faulkner short story I don't want to get into. But the economics, the notion of economics is something that we don't have a lot of indigenous people talking about that. I advise a graduate student who's Pokagon. His name is Tom. He's a wonderful guy. He's in political science. Really a political economy, so he touches into economics, and nobody in the department really wants to talk to him. I mean, they're letting him do his thing, which is nice, but there's only a few people in our field, in the academy, actually who are indigenous, who do much on economics. And if we do, the people that are guiding us are saying, well, we want to hear about Indian gaming, or we want to hear about coal and natural resource extraction. So it's a delight to hear that you were given the opportunity to do this, that they reached out to you. I do want to mention natural law. Natural law in legal circles is sort of, it doesn't mean anything. Natural law is sort of this idea that there are some laws that are just so important. Like they're beyond the Constitution. They're beyond written laws. They're beyond human laws. They're godlike type laws that are just so in basic, and they actually can, in some circumstances, override what humans write as part of our laws, what our legislatures enact, or what our people enact as a constitution. Are there natural laws that Anishinaabe or indigenous peoples would express as being more important than what humans are doing? I think I know the answer to this, but I would like you to talk about that a little bit.
Yes. Done. When I think about natural law, I'm going to put on both hats. I'll start with my scientist hat. When we say natural law, we often mean, these immutable laws by which life and physics are organized. Laws of thermodynamics, right? The fact that systems cannot grow exponentially, relentlessly forever. We know that this is not possible. And yet human beings in this Western society behave as if the laws of thermodynamics have been repealed just on behalf of our species, right? Absolutely ridiculous. And so the laws by which ecosystems run, the laws of reciprocity, the laws of feedback loops that promote balance, these are physical laws. But what I love to understand is that those physical laws, to me, are also spiritual laws. And our practices of always giving back in return for what we have been given, the work of gratitude, the work of generosity and generativity, the understanding of time is moving in a circle. All of these things are, for me, the honorable harvest. These are all parts of our laws, our cultural laws that, through the brilliance of our ancestors, listening to Shkakmikwe, to looking at how natural law is at work on earth and modeling ourselves after that. And so it's that dance between spirit and matter that become our cultural laws. And I must say, I live in Haudenosaunee territory, so a number of my mentors in history and law are Haudenosaunee scholars, and I'm thinking about a wonderful mentor, the late Chief Irving Powless, and he was really instrumental in illuminating the history of the U.S. Constitution, which of course is borrowed from Haudenosaunee governance structures. They don't teach you that in history, but there it is. And he says that, well, you know, they listened pretty well to a lot of the things that we had to say. He said, but they made one mistake, and that is that they wrote a Bill of Rights. Had we done it, it would have been a Bill of Responsibilities. Yeah. And to me, that's the law. That's the law, is that it isn't about rights. We don't own the world. We are the younger brothers of creation. We are here to learn, in humility, learn and care for all of our other relatives. It's laws of responsibility. And man, we have gotten so far away from that.
Well, thank you for that. It reminds me, many years ago, my wife and I, Winona Singles in the audience right now, hosted a conference at Michigan State University's law school. We used to collectively run the Indigenous Law and Policy Center, and I moved down to the bad guys, I guess, Michigan, and Winona's still there doing it. But way back in 2008, we did this conference. We invited a mentor of ours, who was a former vice chairperson here at Grand Traverse Band, Eva Petoskey. I was hoping she'd be here tonight. And we asked Eva to explain for us what Minoba Madswin is. And it's sort of a phrase that in the language more or less means literally something like the act of living life in a good way. And the awesome part about Eva is that she's a person who is married to a lawyer. Both of her kids are lawyers. She's surrounded by lawyers, long-suffering non-lawyers surrounded by lawyers. So we asked her really what I was interested in with the description of Minoba Madswin, what it could mean for lawyers at the time. And she described it in a way that was very visual. She used the dropping of a pebble into a clear pool with the drop leading to concentric circles. You know, you can see the videos of these everywhere, sometimes in really super slow motion. And she said that every action and omission or inaction of a person is like the dropping of that pebble into the clear pool, and it leads to consequences, maybe good or bad, or whatever. And the key element to all of that is that the pebble, the person who dropped the pebble or whatever, that action or inaction, the person who did it was responsible for all of the concentric circles, no matter how far they went out into the universe even. And I thought that was an amazing insight. And it's the exact opposite of what we were taught in schools, and definitely what we were taught in law schools. We silo everything we do. And if you ask anybody around in this community, you know, what is your responsibility to the indigenous peoples here on lands who we are right now? And everybody in this room who lives in this area is a beneficiary of very serious land dispossession. The answer almost always is, I didn't do it. I'm innocent. We have a word for it in the law, innocent purchaser, innocent bystanders. And so I just think it's amazing that I think indigenous people as a general matter are aware that their actions lead to other actions, and they take those into consideration, they take them seriously, and they take responsibility for them. And after she said that, I started looking into, I had a friend who was in the forestry department at Michigan State. It's a guy named Nick Rio, and he wrote a paper that had the word Inawin Dawin in it. And I don't know much language, frankly, and I'm probably butchering the pronunciation of this word, but he kind of described it in the forestry circles as relational accountability. And tell us what do you, when you write about the Serviceberry or just your work in general, how do you incorporate into your writing, I guess you could say, these principles that we're sort of all related, that we have responsibility to each other?
You know, I think I would want to answer that with the same visual metaphor, with something added to it. that as those ripples move out to our families, to our communities, to our nations, to our more than human relatives, to future generations, we all know what happens when that ripple hits the shore. It comes back to you. It comes back to you through your nation, your community, your family, right? And so these concentric circles and waves, we're accountable to all of those. And, you know, I think one of the things that your question prompts for me is the very different understanding of the self in Indigenous ways of knowing and in the Western economic and political self. This hyper-individuality of the world that we live in today, where your self is, you know, it is your physical body, it's your property, it's your territory, right? And perhaps your relations, but yourself is really unitary. Whereas what I love about the ripples of the water coming and coming back is that it's a vision of the self which is absolutely permeable with everyone else. And those ones, I mean, more than human people as well. And that, I think, is at one of the fundamental differences between Western and Indigenous thought, and therefore the way we behave in the world. If we say in West, maybe this is true in Western law too. I don't know anything about it. I never broke the law, honest, no. Yet.
It's early.
Is this, I forgot what I was going to say. As I was thinking about being arrested.
It says a lot about Western law.
It does, and about Western notions of justice. Yeah, absolutely. But I just to return to that point, I think it is this notion of the kin-centric worldview, where it's relationships that matter. It's relationships that are the currency that keeps the world moving, and those relationships come from reciprocity, from gift exchange, which is part of justice. It's Manopa Madiziwen for me is also a kind of justice verb, you know. It is being in balance. It's making things right with every circle in those concentric rings, including our relationships with the more than human world.
That's great. I want to talk a little bit about kinship. You brought that up, and you said you work out of a school in Syracuse, right? Haudenosaunee country, but. For many of you, Haudenosaunee is a sort of the word for the Iroquois Confederacy of the New York State and Ontario. You know, I have my little Michigan tag on, and the funny thing about the Ottawas, especially, and the Ojibways a little bit, and the Haudenosaunees is we're like Michigan and Ohio State. They're Ohio State. So
I'll tell them you said so.
Yeah, you should. We have a great friend who's a Little Traverse person, Eric Hemingway, and I don't know. Years ago, my wife and I were talking with him about something, and I think the World Cup of lacrosse was on, and the Iroquois national team was playing on TV, and they're like one of the greatest, naturally one of the greatest lacrosse countries in the world, and they're not even recognized by the United Nations. And Eric is like, I hate them. I want them to lose every time. So anyway, my point is, there is a point. When you talk about kinship, I'm curious about your background, sort of how you grew up, and what is it about your background, your childhood or young adulthood or whatever, education, that led you in this direction toward writing to becoming a scientist and then becoming a writer and focusing on the things that you focus on?
You know, I was really lucky to grow up on the land, out in the country. And so that was a really important part of my growing up. But I didn't grow up in a Potawatomi community. I grew up in upstate New York. And you think, how did a Potawatomi end up in upstate New York? The answer is Carlisle Indian School. My grandfather was a survivor of Carlisle and tried to go home. He did go home to Oklahoma during those times when no one could make a living there. You couldn't farm there. And so he came back east. He came back east to the Maple Woodlands, and there our family stayed. And so when I was a little kid, I knew my dad just bathed us in stories, and that was so nourishing for me. And then I would ask him things like, well, what's our word for this? Or how do we think about that? Or I was so aware that there were people that I belonged to who were invisible to me. And so when I asked him these questions, he said, I don't know. But he didn't just say, I don't know. He said, I don't know because that was taken from us at Carlisle. That is a very different answer than I don't know. And so as a young person, I can just remember myself as a little girl understanding the injustice of that and thinking if there were schools, the hope that I found in that, if there were schools that could take all of that away, that meant there could be schools that bring it back. And so that notion of school, I knew I wanted to be either a botanist or a poet. And my guidance counselor said, well, you got to choose. You can't do both of those things. And so the plants had already chosen me. So I went with them. But the thing I want to circle back to is having grown up with cultural stories, with family stories of connection, I knew acutely that I didn't have elders in my life to teach me. But I also, at some level, understood, well, who taught my elders? And it was the land. The land taught my elders. And so I thought, okay, I don't have you, Mishomis and Nokomis, but I do have. I don't have you, Mishomis and Nokomis, but I do have the plants. And I think that was part of our bond, is that I would just spend so much time with them to try to say, what do I need to know? So it was a long pathway from that longing to reconnection with our people.
Oh, that's amazing. And it's a rough story to hear, but it's a true thing. And most of the tribes here in Michigan, especially in the Lower Peninsula, were terminated, administratively terminated, we call it, in the 19th and well into the 20th century, really for a century or more, where I'll tell my students, the Department of the Interior just stopped returning our phone calls. And not that we had phones, but, and it's, what's so heartening, I wear this shirt today. This is a shirt that I got at the Potawatomi Gathering about 6 or 8 years ago in the Prairie Band Potawatomi Nation in Kansas. Every year, the 11 Canadian and American United States Potawatomi Nations come together, as I'm sure you know, at the Potawatomi Gathering. They tend to be at where the tribes have the most money, so there's a lot of the Lower Peninsula Potawatomi Nations have resources now. And I grew up in Southwest Michigan, which is Potawatomi country for the most part, and most of my relatives are enrolled in those tribes. And I just remember being a little kid, and my mom had a job as a secretary. She was going to school part-time. My dad, her husband, had a job. He was a construction worker. And in our family, with our extended relatives, we were like the richest people around. We had some of my mom's cousins went to University of Michigan in the 1960s, and they were around. They were pharmacists. One of them worked for the Indian Health Service for a long time. But in that community, when we would go visiting all the relatives, we seemed like we were the rich ones, and we didn't really have that much money at all. But it's amazing now to see, now that the tribes have been reaffirmed, restored, and either through an act of Congress or some other way, but really since 1980, it's really the existence of the tribes, that acknowledgement, the reaffirmation of tribal sovereignty that has brought everything back. And it's far from perfect. I mean, we have tiny little land bases. The tribes don't have much land. Our populations are still very low. And we have a lot of need, a lot of resources that we desperately need to have. And no matter how wealthy or how much money we get from the federal government, it's never really going to be enough. But the Potawatomi gathering for this year was at the Matchi-Benashewish, which is the Gun Lake tribe in Allegan County. And it was a delight to go there. And I'd see a lot of relatives and see friends, people you just don't see a whole lot from around the country. You know, the tribal judges go to these things too, and it's a lot of fun. One of the things that happens at these gatherings is a giveaway, a gifting. And you talk about that in Serviceberry and probably in Braiding Sweetgrass too, how when you say economy, it's a gifting economy, right? So the way to, one of my distant, much older ancestors is a guy named Leopold Pokagon, and he was, I've studied his history a little bit. There's a tribe actually named after him, the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi Indians. And he was later in his later years known as an Ogama, or a leader. And the way that Anishinaabe people become leaders, and I think this is true for a lot of Anishinaabe or indigenous peoples around the country, nations around the country, is not by hoarding wealth and exercising power, by sort of lording over everybody, but by giving everything away. And the person or the people, the families that were the most able to care for the most number of people, which is kind of like this gifting economy, were the most influential. They were the ones who had more, they had the skills to pay the bills, so to speak. And that's one of the great things that it's nice to see that in the 21st century you have these tribes that are sort of coming back from all of this. You know, a lot of my grandmother's relatives were at Mount Pleasant Indian boarding school. A lot of my wife's relatives went to Holy Childhood up at Harbor Springs. And, you know, it was just the end. They lost all of their ability, not just their culture and their language, but even the ability to know what a parent was like. So whole generations of Indian people in Michigan and around the country didn't even know what a real parent was. They were an institution. And it's just amazing to see some of that come back. But one of the cool things about the gifting, and I don't really know what to make of this, but I was sitting there with my mom and a bunch of cousins I haven't seen for a long time. And there's a big announcement on the PA from the MC at the powwow, and he said, "Come on down, everybody's getting a big bag of bluebird flour." And I looked over, and there were pallets of these, hundreds of these things. And then I walked over just as a lark, like, "Can I have one?" I'm not even enrolled in a tribal member. Me and my son Owen went over there, and they're like, "Take as many as you want." So we grabbed one. We don't make a lot of things with flour, but the bluebird flour obviously is what was used, a lot of Indian people around the country used to make fry bread. That's what was basically a commodity flour. And, but it's like terrible for you. So let's talk about food sovereignty.
We can go there, but I also want to talk about the gathering. I was there. I spent last week in Gun Lake for the gathering. It was wonderful, and you know, because the Citizen Potawatomi were giving away commodity flour, a group of young tribal members, CPN members as well, said, "I think we need to do something different," and so we all put together to say, let's also provide other gifts for our relatives, and because the giveaway is so important, it is that cultural memory, that cultural echo of reciprocity, of always giving gifts out of respect, and not only out of respect, but of redistribution of wealth. And the Potawatomi gatherings that they're now on close to 25, almost 30 years of these gatherings that were started as an antidote to the fragmentation that came from removal, because we are all one people. And because of this violent colonial history, we were all, from Canada to Oklahoma. And so the wisdom of leaders like Stuart King, who said, no, we are all one nation, we have to come back together. And in these gatherings, the nations all pool their money to be able to support each other in this, and it rotates from one nation to the next. It's a beautiful act of what it means to be both sovereign entities and a collective voice. And it was at the gatherings, the things like that were instrumental for me, was the first time I ever heard the language spoken was at the gathering. And then all the cultural workshops, that it's really acts of healing and resurgence, and food celebration of both our traditional foods, traditional in both ways, of the resurgence of food sovereignty in growing our beautiful Potawatomi watermelons and the ancient squash and those beautiful Potawatomi lima beans. So seed sharing and the care for those seeds that hold the memories of our ancestors, to say nothing of the really brilliant good food and the brilliant indigenous science of plant breeding and growing in polyculture. The resurgence of indigenous food sovereignty has so much to teach us in a world where, when I fly over Michigan or Iowa or Illinois, and there's nothing but corn and soybeans. This notion of these poisonous landscapes, when there's a very clear, already demonstrated alternative in polyculture, in indigenous science of those plants working together. I think it's one of the most important examples of how indigenous science and philosophy could be a guide to a new, I was going to say a new way of being. No, to remembering the right way of being. It's not new. Can I ask, though, I love going to the food sovereignty summits. One recently at Pokagon. Do you have a favorite traditional food?
Minoman, white rice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Your body, my body does a happy dance. I put Minoman in my mouth and it's like, yes, this is what we were meant for. Yeah.
It's amazing stuff. I want to tell a story that's sort of a weird little anecdote. My wife and I've known this guy, Frank Edowagishik, for the longest time, since I was a little kid. And he was the one who performed the ceremony for my wife and I when we got married back in 2004. And he also went to University of Michigan. And so we were talking years and years ago about the Ann Arbor Food Co-op, which is one of the older ones in the country, I assume. And he was there when it started, and he said there were several college students going to U of M back in late 60s, early 70s who were having a hard time finding good food. They didn't have a lot of money, and they cut a deal, what we would call like a farm share right now, and they cut a deal with some local farmers who would bring some stuff in, and they would share it collectively amongst the students, and I imagine I don't know if it was a bartering system. I don't know what the story was. But they did this for a little while. And Frank and some other people got this idea to start the Ann Arbor Food Co-op. And it created what I think in retrospect is a hilarious ideological split between Frank and the people who wanted to start effectively what is the Ann Arbor Food Co-op and the others who are calling them a bunch of capitalist pigs. And we've talked a little bit about how your book is really your book is an economic story, but how do we break into the ideological split? And I'm not talking about the capitalist pig thing. That's just sort of an entree. I loved my father dearly. But if I hinted that I was like some sort of democratic socialist, he would have stopped talking to me. Because the word socialist, I might as well have said I was a Nazi. It was just, by definition, was unacceptable. I should go live in Soviet Russia if I were going to be a socialist, or I guess a communist. But how do you breach those ideological barriers? And people don't even think about them. They just hear something like an emotionally potent oversimplification, and they can't get past it. They don't even want to get past it.
I talk about it by avoiding those labels because they're so laden with misinformation and misperception. And the way that I like to talk about economic thinking grounded in indigenous principles, as I understand them, and natural law, is this notion of the gift, that what Western science and Western political systems, economic systems, calls natural resources, this notion of commoditizing the commons. Let's take water, that how can you own water? Water is a gift. We don't deserve it. We didn't pay for it. We didn't work for it. It just comes. And, inherent in capitalism is this idea that something which is a gift, which is common to all of us, and anyone across the political spectrum, I hope at this point would be nodding their heads like, oh yes, absolutely, clean water. It's a human right. We didn't make it. It is given to us. And so then to say, all right, well, I'm going to take that water and I'm going to own it. And then I'm going to sell water. How can you sell what you don't own? Well, hello, capitalism. This conversion of common gifts to private property is at the heart of this. And so the indigenous notion of the land as gift that we then share with one another, dish with one spoon kind of thinking of law, right? As opposed to this idea that those things which are commonly held, if I get there first and can grab them and package them and value added, then I can sell it. To me, that is corruption. These are gifts, and so when we change our minds to think about the world as made up of gifts and not of commodities, everything else falls in line. I'll have to tell you a story because it was at Michigan that I was giving a keynote about something or other in the Department of Natural Resources, the College of Natural Resources, sorry. And they were saying, well, we recognize that our name, natural resources, is pretty outdated. Where it doesn't recognize the intrinsic value of the land. It's only valuable when we make it into something. They said, yeah, we need to change our name. And so at the end of my talk, I said, I have a suggestion for you, for your name of your college. And I said, what about the College of Earthly Gifts? That's what they did. They said, oh. And this whole room full of scientists was like, oh. And that tells you everything. Who doesn't want to work for the Department of Earthly Gifts? Right? And wouldn't we behave very differently if we named trees and water and soil as gifts? We would. And so this may seem oversimplified, but to me, we could solve so many of our problems by changing our minds. We're all about changing technology and policy, but we never think about changing ourselves. But if we change ourselves to gift thinking, everything else falls in line. In fact, at the end of that gathering, we were talking about that collective sigh of how much people yearn for that. And he said, well, yeah, that's beautiful. I wish that were true. He said, but it would kind of put the kibosh on grinding up trees. Like correct. Yeah.
Brilliant. I really appreciated in Serviceberry, and I haven't gone back to Braiding Sweetgrass in a while, and maybe you talk about it there too, but the notion in Serviceberry that I think I took away from more than anything else was the notion that indigenous people, Anishinaabe people, went to their food rather than force the food to come to them. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that is, I was asked many years ago to write the legal history or the history of the Grand Traverse Band, sort of an updated version of this. And one of the things I learned from mostly, ironically, reading old historical reports about the tribe from about the 1840s until 1860s, 1870s, was that really the description of how we lost our land. And occasionally it would be somebody would show up with a gun and threaten our ancestors and they would just leave. But mostly what it was that we were told by the federal government in our treaties that we needed to select parcels of land. They were called allotments, and we would have to live on those lands, whatever we selected. And the theory of allotment was that we would become farmers. And there are some farms around here, but we're above the growing season. We're too far north for a growing season for like most cash crops. Obviously, we have vineyards and orchards now, and I'll get to that in a second. So we were asked as Anishinaabe people to become farmers, to find plots of land, 40 acres or something like that, and become farmers. And here's the deal, is that we would select these lands, go live on them, maybe even build a lodge, a cabin, house, whatever, stick house, whatever, and then we would leave because we're seasonal people, right? In the summertime, we're on the beaches. We're farming, we're collecting foods and doing things we need to do for the summer to get ready for the winter. Yeah. We're also traveling, doing a lot of hunting. You know what summer is, it's awesome. And then winter, we would be sort of inland in the forest growth. That's where more of the shelter was, and we would hunker down. That's when you tell your stories. That's where you teach your children about the culture in great detail. It's like school. And in the spring, we would do the sugar bush. And then in the summer, we'd move back out to the beaches again. And that was sort of loosely speaking, our seasonal thing. And as soon as we would move away from that lodge that we built in our allotment, we'd come back a week later and there'd be somebody living there. We had abandoned our allotment. And when a non-Indian person said that this Indian abandoned their allotment, they don't want to live here anymore, and we would say, no, we didn't, guess who they would believe? That's how we lost our land, okay? So I love to hear, in Serviceberry, I love that you were focusing on how we did the things we did because we were looking for really this most sustainable way to continue our lifestyles, right? Our life ways. And that necessity is what really builds into who we became and were as a matter of culture, as a matter of really law and policy in a lot of respects.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. That practice of following the seasonal rounds from fish camp and sugar camp and berry picking camp. Of course, our home was big. It had many rooms in it. And so we went to where the gifts were, in a sense, right? We went to where the gifts were, and we weren't passive in that. That was, of course, some of the other blindness of the colonists was this myth of the pristine, that all of these berries and rice and fish were all just there provided by Mother Nature. Oh, she was very generous in that way, but of course it was our participation in this. As we moved over the landscape, we were also tending that landscape using sophisticated indigenous ecological sciences. And so this notion that we abandoned our allotments is tied up with that Western perception and that Western narrow perception that if these people don't live like we do, then they're not using the land. land, when in fact we were using the land really abundantly and richly in tending it in ways that mimic natural disturbance, so that biodiversity was enhanced by our presence. And this seasonal rounds, which provided so much food security for people and sort of hedges your bets. If the berries aren't good this year, something else will be, by having this diversity of foodstuffs, as opposed to, the American diet today relies primarily on 4 plants. It's ridiculous. All these other gifts and that are available to us, we could reduce our impact on the land so greatly if we diversified. Our people understood wealth, and food security was biodiversity. And food security in the eyes of the settler and today in corporate agriculture is monoculture and cash, as opposed to biodiversity. So very, very different footprint on the land, and therefore really different nutritional status and well-being, both of land and of people. I think our seasonal rounds showed over and over again that people are good for the land. People can be good for the land when we follow our traditional cultural laws.
We definitely tried to adapt to monoculture when we were in the allotment period of that time. And in the 1840s, there are plenty of stories historically about the Odawas and being incredibly wealthy and prominent, really throughout the whole Great Lakes. You guys know that the capital of Canada is Ottawa? It's nowhere near around here. That's how far we would trade our sugar. In the 1840s, we were North America's greatest producer of sugar for, I guess, tea? I don't know. What do you use sugar for? But so we started monetizing our sugar bush, the sort of the monoculture. And we're talking about 10 years. It was awesome, but then it was over. Same with the beaver trade, the fur trade, right? And by the way, there's apples around here. We thought we were the ones who figured out apples grow here. And so we were stuck in lands. We were isolated and confined in lands that really weren't really useful for anything. And we figured out a thing that you could use them for. You can grow apples, you can grow, have these orchards. And that's one of the reasons those are here now to this day. But again, not terribly sustainable, because part of the problem is that, there's a search in Western political thought, economic thought, for the greatest wealth maximizing opportunity. And what was for the colonizer coming into Michigan and really much of North America, the most valuable things. You might think it's oil and gold or whatever, coal. It was trees. This whole peninsula is covered in beautiful old growth, white pine, timber, all sorts of beautiful trees, birch, beech, Upper Peninsula, and it was completely deforested. The trees you see around us here, these are all brand new compared to how old those forests were, completely destroyed. And that was our lifehood. I mean, we could not exist in our way once those trees were gone. And notwithstanding the fact that we were being driven out of the area because where we were living in terms of land ownership. And we depended so heavily on that, it completely gutted our culture, who we're as people. And it's just amazing. Yeah. One of the things I really like about your work, and I asked you about some of this stuff the last time, I do remember this, is that you use the stories, Anishinaabe stories. I'm totally mispronouncing it, but Adazokan, these are sacred stories that sometimes they involve tricksters like Nanabuju. Sometimes they're just stories sometimes of supernatural creatures, thunderbirds, underwater panthers, or just things that happen that teach us ways to live, things that we should be doing right and wrong and that sort of thing. And I'm going to ask you, what is your favorite story like that, if you have one?
Oh, man. Well, I love the Nanabojo stories. when he chars his butt at the fire. And, there's so many great stories, especially because it almost always ends up in the creation of lichens. And as a botanist who studies mosses and lichens, I really love those stories. Like, oh, there's scabs. So I love the funny origin stories, right? But a story that's been really on my mind, it's actually not a Anishinaabe story, but it's really living with me, and I was talking about it just the other night, is part of a Haudenosaunee story called The Mighty Shout. This story is about the twins, the Sky Woman's grandsons, the forces of creation and destruction, right? Those boys who, even in the womb, were tussling and wrestling, and when they were out in the world, one of the twins was, he made the rivers run both ways, so we would never have to paddle upstream. Like, I'm good with that, yeah. And then his brother came along. And here we are. His brother, one of them made blackberries. Ooh, it's blackberry season, picking at home anyway, probably here too. And they're so delicious and wonderful, and his brother put the thorns on them. You see the picture. And so in this story, which is stories upon stories, as you know, the story comes down to that these two boys really were holding, what's the world going to be like, full of creation or destruction. And in this telling, they decided that they were going to play a gambling game in order to decide who wins. They were going to play the Peachstone game, and so they had 24 hours, one whole cycle to play. And if all the stones came up black, the destructive twin would win, and the world would be destroyed. If they all came up on the white side of those painted stones, then the world would continue in creation. And so they played and they played and they played, and no one ever won. The stones didn't all come one way, just they were always a mix, until they said that the sun was coming up, and those boys tossed the stones one more time. And that they began to fall, and the first one was black. And the next one was black. And the next one was black. Until there was only one stone left in the air. And in this story, it says that all the beings were watching these boys gambling with the future of life on Earth. Yeah. And as that one stone hung there, all the beings, the birds and the trees and the insects and the fish, everyone drew in their breath as one and gave a mighty shout. And the breath, that sacred breath, was a wind that was so powerful in their voices that it turned that stone and set it down white side up, life side up. And so the world continues today with creation and destruction at work. But that it was the mighty shout of all of our relatives that saved us from our own foolishness. And that story, I think about it almost every day, because we are in exactly this moment of gambling with the future of life.
And we're always on the precipice. There's just that one stone saving us.
Yes.
You know, when I first started thought teaching, my wife and I were at the University of North Dakota, and the Haudenosaunees had a case in the Supreme Court. And we thought, this is an awesome case, they're going to win. It was about taxes. There's nothing worse than an Indian law tax case.
Cheryl?
City of Sherrill. You know what I'm talking about?
I know what you're talking about.
By the way, speaking of Indian tax cases, I wrote articles on tax. My wife and I met and worked together and kind of fell in love while negotiating a tax agreement with the state of Michigan. It's weird.
Wow.
It's weird. But anyway, I don't like thinking about taxes anymore. But so yeah, we're in North Dakota and far away from our homeland. So I'm glad we're back home now. But yeah, they had this case in the Supreme Court, and the court ruled against the Oneida Indian Nation on this tax case. And, you know, whatever, it's a tax case, who cares? Pay your damn taxes, move on. But it was worse than that. It was an opinion which was written, I want you all to know, by a legend, Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Quite possibly, the City of Sherrill case versus Oneida Indian Nation is one of the most racist things you will ever see. It basically said this tribe reacquired some land. They wanted to do tribal stuff on it, and they didn't want to pay the City of Sherrill, Oneida County, Madison County, State of New York. They didn't want to pay taxes to them. They're not really obligated to do so. And the Supreme Court said, yeah, you are. And here's the reason why. You didn't own this land for 200 years. And suddenly you buy it and think you don't have to pay taxes. Actually, you do. And the way the opinion reads is like this. Anytime an Indian tribe brings a lawsuit, and not even if they win or lose, but if they even just bring the lawsuit and it is disruptive, I'm using the word disruptive on purpose because that's what they use, to the settled expectations of the non-Indian settlers, then that lawsuit must be summarily dismissed. Any lawsuit. So every single lawsuit, frankly, under this reasoning, which is a little bit broad, that any Indian tribe or Indian person has ever brought, not just on taxes, but on anything, should be summarily dismissed under this reasoning. And to RBG's credit, near the end of her life, she said publicly once, you know, that's the case that she probably regretted writing more than anything. But it's hanging over our heads at any given moment. Anytime a court feels like reading City of Sherrill and dismissing an Indian law or an Indian rights case, they can do it. It just happened in Oklahoma the other day. Now, Oklahoma kind of sucks, so that's totally understandable. And sorry, that's where Citizen Potawatomi is, but when this case came out, I was worried that it was going to happen in Michigan, right? Mm-hmm. That the Michigan courts or the Supreme Court would get a hold of a Michigan tribal case and just say, no, you got to get rid of this. And all the Haudenosaunee land claims cases were summarily dismissed, like just dominoes falling one after the other. It was devastating. But here's the thing. I'm going to bring my buddy Nick Rio up. I never thought I was going to talk about Nick Rio. I haven't seen him in years.
Also a friend of mine.
Yes, you know,
yeah.
So good. We were talking about disruption theory in forest fires. And he's like, that disruption theory is awesome. Yes, forest fires are bad. We don't really like them. But guess what? Forest fires clear out space. And they are disruptive, but they create change. So berry season after a forest fire is awesome, for example. Mm-hmm. So disruption.
Absolutely. And you know, that notion of disruption and that because it's disruptive to the settler population, that consequence. Some years after that, as you probably know, Onondaga Nation was filing their land rights action. And I want to share this with you in an audience of neighbors to a sovereign indigenous nation. Because Onondaga, even despite Sherrill, decided to do this a little differently, right? And they filed their land rights action, which was simply a request for recognition of ancestral territory. And so instead, the community in Syracuse, New York, decided that they didn't want to have intercommunity strife. They wanted to demonstrate that this would not be disruptive, would in fact be welcomed by the city of Syracuse. And an ally organization formed called Neighbors of Onondaga Nation. And this wonderful organization worked for several years as the land rights action was moving through the courts. And what they did is to have a stage like this with the Haudenosaunee, teacher and a settler teacher together on the same stage. Let's talk about women's rights with a women's suffragists historian and some clan mothers. Let's talk about lacrosse with Oren Lyons and the coach of Syracuse University. Oh, they really got into it. Oren teased them about, you guys play with those Tupperware sticks. It was great. So anyway, a year-long series of understanding, choosing topics and understanding it from both perspectives. It was powerful. And when Onondaga Nation went to federal court in Albany, they didn't go alone. We chartered bus after bus of citizens of Syracuse who went to pack that class courtroom to say, this is not disruptive. This is exactly what we want because justice is a public good. This did not deter. I sat in that courtroom where the attorney for the state of New York invoked the doctrine of discovery. Yeah, yeah. And they dismissed the case. But the reason I tell you this story is that, and I'd love to hear your thinking about this, that inevitably courts reflect culture. Courts reflect community sentiment. And in this case where a settler society, neighbors of a sovereign indigenous nation, stood up for their neighbors. They did their homework. They educated themselves. They decolonized their historical thinking in order that they could stand up for justice. And to me, it's a really inspiring case of what does it mean to go to beyond land acknowledgement to enact land justice. And so I just want to share that story with you as a seed.
So, my response to that.
Yeah.
You said, what do you think? What do I think about this? I'll give you 1 minute what I tell law students. And I tell Indian lawyers too, and I think they're starting to come around on this. Here's the thing about the United States Supreme Court. They're smart people.
Oh, tell us, please.
They're smart, but none of them have ever practiced law. They don't know a damn thing. No, other than Justice Sotomayor, who was a federal prosecutor, not a single one of them has ever participated in a trial. Yes, they all practiced law before they became judges, but the kind of law they practiced was whispering in the ears of people like George Bush and saying, here's how to screw people over. And they didn't spend any time in court. Occasionally they would argue cases as appellate judges, or as appellate advocates, and then that helps you get into the Supreme Court. But they actually don't know the nitty-gritty, the practice of the law. And in Indian law, they know even less because they don't know anything about what goes on in Indian country. They don't really know much about the practice of law. And one of the reasons Cheryl was so frustrating is because the court didn't know anything about the rules of civil procedure. They were just making it up. And so the great thing about that is that tribes are timeless entities. And we might lose a case in the Supreme Court, but we don't just give up. We turn around, we go back and figure out a way to get around that decision. And so what you saw after Cheryl and the summary dismissal of all these land claim cases in Haudenosaunee country was that the tribes thought of different alternative routes to get their reservations back. And Oneida in particular, St. Regis Mohawk, they were really successful. Here in Michigan, Saginaw Chippewa got its reservation back. Keweenaw Bay Indian community did too. And you're not going to win all those cases, but just because the court says one thing, and no matter how outrageous it is, doesn't mean you have to give up. So that's a great thing.
Time? Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. We're going to do a Q&A in a few minutes, but one of the things that I think would be a great opportunity for us today is if you would read some of your book so we could hear your words in your voice.
Happy to. Yeah, I understand this is a part of the tradition of the National Writers Series, and I'm happy to be part of that legacy. But it's hard to hold a book and a mic. Hold on. I think I just have to find my place, then I think I'll be all right. Hey, somebody signed this. I want to just bring you to what is, for me, one of my favorite kinds of writing. You know, I love trying to challenge people's imaginations and assumptions about the way the world is. I like that argumentative part of writing. But what I really love is the land. And so an opportunity to just go on a field trip together. So many people are blind to the land. They don't have this experiences of intimacy with the land. And I think that my job as a writer has, as I see it, one of those jobs to help people fall in love with the land again. And so let's try it. The cool breath of evening slips off the wooded hills, displacing the heat of the day, and with it come the birds, as eager for the cool as I am. They arrive in a flock of calls that sound like laughter, and I have to laugh back with the same delight. They're all around me. Cedar waxwings and catbirds and a flash of bluebird iridescence. I have never felt such a kinship to my namesake, Robin, as in this moment when we are both stuffing our mouths with berries and chortling with happiness. The bushes are laden with fat clusters of red, blue, and wine purple in every stage of ripeness. So many you can pick them by the handful. I'm glad I have a pail, and it's getting pretty heavy. The birds carry their berries in the buckets of their, I think it's bellies, and wonder if they will be able to fly with so much cargo on board. This abundance of berries feels like a pure gift from the land. I have not earned, paid for, nor labored for them. There is no mathematics of worthiness that reckons I deserve them in any way. And yet here they are, along with the sun and the air and the birds and the rain, gathering in towers of cumulonimbi, a distant storm building. You could call them natural resources or ecosystem services, but the robins and I know them as gifts. We both sing gratitude with our mouths full. Part of my delight comes from their unexpected presence. I never imagined that I could pick them here. The local native serviceberries, Amelanchier arborea, have small hard fruits which tend toward dryness, and only once in a while is there a tree with sweet offerings. The bounty in my bucket today is a western species, A. ulnifolia, known as Saskatoons, planted by my farmer neighbors, Polly and Ed. This is their first bearing year, and they produce berries with an enthusiasm that matches my own. Saskatoon, Juneberry, Shadbush, Shadblow, Sugar Plum, Sarvis, Serviceberry. These are among the many names for Amelanchier. Ethnobotanists know that the more names a plant has, the greater its cultural importance. The tree is beloved for its fruits, for medicinal use, and for the early froth of flowers that whiten woodland edges at the first hint of spring. Serviceberry is known as a calendar plant. So faithful is it to seasonal weather patterns. Its bloom is a sign that the ground has thawed. In this folklore, this was the time that mountain roads became passable for circuit preachers who arrived to conduct church services. It is also a reliable indicator to fisher folk that the shad are running upstream, or at least it was, back in the day when rivers were clear and free enough to support the spawning of shad. Calendar plants like serviceberry are important for synchronizing our seasonal rounds of traditional indigenous peoples who move in an annual cycle through their homelands to where the foods are ready. Instead of changing the land to suit their convenience, they change themselves. Eating with the seasons is a way of honoring abundance by going to meet it when and where it arrives. A world full of produce warehouses and grocery stores enables the practice of having what you want when you want it. We force the food to come to us at considerable financial and ecological costs, rather than following the practice of taking what has been given to us, each in its own time. These service berries were not coerced, and their carbon footprint is nothing. Maybe that's why they taste so good. They come only this time of year, these ephemeral sips of summer, without an aftertaste of harm.
Well, whoever told you you couldn't be a poet and a scientist at the same time? Dead wrong. Well, I think we have a few minutes for questions from the audience, and I understand there are microphones at the head of the aisles here if you'd like to ask a question.
Look at that, there are people out there.
I know.
Could you talk briefly about nurturing the eighth fire?
Could I talk
Could you talk briefly about nurturing the eighth fire, the movement?
Wow. There's so much backstory. I think I would simply say that, the Anishinaabe teachings of the prophecy of the people of the seventh fire, which may be familiar to many of you. Yes? No. Yes. No. We have to do choral speaking here. These teachings, and I want to compress this, talk about many of the changes that befell our people since the first fire, when we lived with our Wabanaki relatives at the mouth of the St. Lawrence River. And it was understood that big changes were coming to Turtle Island. And so to safeguard the sacred fire, that is our teachings, our laws, that we would have to move inland to protect them. And so the people kept going until the place where the food grows on the water, to the lands of wild rice. In those seven fires, the teachers arose that said, keep going, because there's going to come a time when your land, you're no longer living in your own homelands. You keep moving, there's going to come a time when people come among you to break your spiritual traditions. Keep going. There's going to come a time when you no longer speak your language. There is going to come a time when they take your children away from you. All of these prophecies we know have come to pass, right? Over these fires, these history of our people. And it's said that there will even come a time when you can no longer dip your cup into the river and drink. At that time, the air will become too thick to breathe. And our plant and animal relatives will begin to turn their faces away from us. That's where we are, no? And it's said that the people, and there's so many different versions of these teachings, but the one that was shared with me is that it will be the Anishinaabe and the Zaganash, the newcomers as well. We will be standing together at a fork in the road. And we have two paths ahead of us, and one of them is soft and green and dewy and beautiful, and we could walk down that path. And the other one is a dead end. And it's made up under our feet of like burnt black cinders. But the brilliance of that teaching is that it says, in the time of the seventh fire, when the people have to make this choice, you just don't go dancing down that green path. Our job is to turn around along the ancestors' path and pick up what was left for us. In many cases, what was taken from us. Pick up the language, pick up the stories, pick up the law, pick up the ethics, pick up our plant and animal relatives. And when we have tenderly wrapped them up and held them close, and then we meet at that fork in the road, and together, when we have retrieved those teachings, we can then walk down that green path together to the lighting of the eighth fire that will go on and on. So we know that the people of the seventh fire are going to need tremendous courage, because it will be a time of suffering, this time of crisis and of choice, that we need each other, we need our ancestral teachings, we need our plant and animal relatives in order to have the strength, the courage, and the vision to make the right choice. And so that's a very brief summary of that notion that you know, in Anishinaabe ways, time moves in a circle. And so therefore prophecy and history meet. And they're meeting in this moment. And we all have a responsibility to what we are to do. And to remember that I think of this time in a way as, you know, as a biologist, I hear all the time about this is the age of the sixth extinction. This is the age of the climate precipice. It's the age of fill in the blank of nightmares. But I think of this as the age of remembering. That we have to remember our teachings. We have to remember natural law. We have to ally ourselves with natural law, with the teachings of the plants, the teachings of the land. And when we do that, we can make decisions that honor life and help life continue. In a way, it is our time of giving that mighty shout. Thanks for asking.
Hi, Robin. We've got a question back here on your left. Yeah, back over here.
Hi, Robin. Hi, Matt. Welcome to Traverse City from Michigan Writers. Robin, my question is what we learned from COVID. It seemed that we were more able to have mutual aid towards one another. This has always been really popular in the disability community. You couldn't buy everything that you needed. You needed to trade. You needed to give the extra that you had. And I'm wondering if you think that, how do we hang on to those lessons that we experienced during COVID for some of us?
Thank you so much for that question. I think about that a lot because during that time, it was a time of great learning, right? Of mutual reliance. It was a time of, I guess you could kindly call it, values clarification. We came to know what was really important. It was also a time of, I think, a development of not only our capacity for compassion for one another, members of our own species, but it was a time of the development of more ecological compassion as well, as people found safety and sanctuary in being outdoors and understanding what the healing gifts of the land. I fear that in our haste, everyone was saying, oh, I just can't wait to get back to normal. We missed something. We missed an opportunity. And I don't think it's too late to remember, but I think that the notion of our mutual reliance, of the heroes among us, the notion of how we care for one another, that it's some of the themes of the Serviceberry, of how do we take whatever we have in abundance and share it with others so everybody has what they need. We discovered in ourselves or remembered in ourselves that that's who we are. And I hope that we will turn back again to remember that.
So I have a question about sort of the method of that remembering. You mentioned a lot that natural resources, maybe better called earthly gifts, are given without deservingness, without having to labor, like they come into the world independent of this market economy and this idea of producing and deserving and production. And that is very true of natural gifts. At the same time, we have this massive economic apparatus of huge wealth production, catastrophe production, this incredible like biosocial physical machine that we've built on the capacity of money to do this sort of asocial global cooperation. And it feels like a bit of a tension. Like,
A bit.
I guess my question is really like, people and Western anthropologists across history have seen the gift economy as a sort of potential for an alternative future, as well as a past. And I want to remember that. And at the same time, I want to know what you think about how that global economy apparatus would survive properly remembering, and where markets and money fit into that, if they do at all.
How long do we have? It's a great question, and you know what? I want to turn back to something that we were talking about disruption. And our mutual colleague, Nick Rio, another Indigenous ecologist, invoking the teachings of the land around disruption and around competitive dominance, right? In ecological systems that are highly competitive, that are competitively dominant to the point that they displace others. These exist, of course, in nature. And I would submit to you that this massive economic system that you're talking about is one such behemoth, a dominant phenomenon that is crowding other things out. Well, what happens in nature? What happens in nature is natural disturbance. It is windstorms, ice storms, that are natural phenomena to which these big competitive systems are vulnerable. And what happens is that eventually they topple. Eventually they topple because they're not really sustainable. And what happens is that the understory, those species that were kind of waiting, now is their opportunity to grow up. This is why it's so important to have a diverse forest floor, because it's resilience. When disturbance happens, the others are waiting to take its place. And my dreaming around the gift economy is that we need to create that understory. These systems of gift exchange, these systems of mutual aid, these systems of compassion for one another at a small scale at which the gift economy works, so that when disruption happens, the replacement of that old and no longer working for us has an understory to replace it. So I'm really talking about having a symbiosis between these things, that they can live in parallel with one another, as in a sense the resilience built into the system. Yeah.
Well, I'm told the Union Boys are about to shut us down, so we have 40 seconds left, so 25 words or less.
Okay, Ms. Kimmerer, thank you for writing Braiding Sweetgrass. I've had the pleasure of introducing the book to several members of my family, including my mother. There was a chapter in that book, or a section, about working with the pond and trying to get your kids to swim in this. Can you talk about the self-doubt and sort of like working through that perseverance and feeling like it's actually worth doing this thing to work with the land, and that your ideas were meant to be shared in that way?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked that question and not how's my pond doing. I was worried for a minute there. Oh, well, it may, I have to go back maybe and read how I wrote that, but it might read like this, sort of, it is persistence. It's absolutely persistence and dedication to healing that water and that community and taking care of those birds, as well as my children who did not like to swim there, but my grandkids wade there. And for me, it is a matter of commitment, but I also want to say, because this is so important doing restoration work and in land care work, I did it because I loved doing it. I did it because it was joyful, because I liked getting muddy and looking at little filaments of algae. To me, the work of resistance, let's put this in a broader context, the work of this moment is hard, it is long, it is heartbreaking. It therefore has to be joyful as well, because that is what's going to keep us going.
Well, on that note, on behalf of National Writers Series and Grand Traverse Band and the other sponsors, thank you so much, Robin.
Thank you for joining us for this special presentation from the National Writers Series. Don't miss our 2 Traverse City Food and Wine events with Anthony Porowski of Queer Eye, along with a panel event where Top Chef winners dish about reality TV cooking shows. For more information, go to nationalwritersseries.org.